Hello bookworms, I'm Hannah, and today I'm doing a spoiler-free video sharing my thoughts on the 5 books I chose to read this February in celebration of Black History Month. I'll be posting a separate wrap-up video a few days from now with my overall top reads from the month of February, so keep your eyes peeled for that. And I'll be going over these books today in order from least to top favorite, so let's get started. The first book is Brown Girl Dreaming by Jacqueline Woodson. This is an autobiographical middle grade novel written in free verse about the author's experience growing up in America in the 1960s and 70s. What I like about this book is that it introduces young readers to the civil rights movement and to important historical figures. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, James Baldwin, Rosa Parks, and Ruby Bridges are all mentioned in this book. The reason I ranked this book at the bottom of the list is because it had no emotional impact on me as a reader. At the risk of sounding redundant, I believe my feelings of detachment have to do with the author being born at an interesting time when interesting people were doing interesting things, but she's largely a distant bystander, so I, as a reader, became a casual viewer of someone's relatively normal day-to-day life. Nonetheless, this book is a cadent portrait of cherishing family, fighting for what's right, and working toward a better world. Next up is Homegoing by Yaa Gyasi. This is a multi-generational saga that follows the descendants of 2 half-sisters, Effia and Essie, across 3 centuries, beginning in 18th century Ghana and arriving at the present day in America. I harbor an unpopular opinion of this book, so let's just get my criticisms out of the way first. My problem with Homegoing is that every chapter introduces a new character. Not only does this mean there's loads of backstory to wade through, it gives readers no time to form any sort of emotional attachment with any of the characters. In many cases, a character's story reaches its apex and then the chapter just ends, giving no sense of resolution until 2 chapters later, when a conclusion to a character's story is just a few sentences tacked on to their descendant's story. Reading this book is akin to reading a collection of short stories, most of which lack a complete story arc. I also struggled to keep straight which character was a descendant of Effia or Essie, even though the chapters alternate between the 2 ancestral lines. At the beginning of this book is a helpful family tree, but I found myself turning back to it with annoying regularity. Each chapter is titled with a character's name, and I think readers would have benefited enormously from inclusion of a date, location, and some mention of whose ancestor they're reading about. Sunny, 1960, America, 5th generation descendant of Essie. See how easy that was? The most notable element of this book is Effia and Essie. They are the characters that stayed fresh in my mind even though their names are irritatingly similar. Effia means born on a Friday, Essie means born on a Sunday. As far as I can tell, the day on which they're born has no bearing on the story, so couldn't they have had names that were a little easier to differentiate? Either way, Effia and Essie are the characters who shine, and I'd have loved to read an entire novel about just their story. Whenever I read a book, I mark passages that I find moving and either work them into my written reviews, add them to my favorite quotes on Goodreads, or jot them down in my journal to later enjoy or ponder. I didn't mark a single passage while reading this book. I rustled up 2 applicable quotes to include in my Goodreads review, but nothing in this book struck me as being lyrical or profound or so dazzling that I wanted to remember it forever. Homegoing is a commendable debut, but it doesn't live up to the hype. I didn't expect to be as moved as I was by Freedom Over Me by Ashley Bryan. This is a Newbery Honor book that has a lasting impact. In July of 1828, a woman named Mrs. Fairchild sold her estate, which included the appraisal and sale of her slaves. Those slaves were listed by their name and sale price on an actual document owned by the author. Now, he uses free verse and mixed media collage created with historical ephemera to reimagine the lives of those slaves. The author introduces each slave and their role on Mrs. Fairchild's property, then shows what life was like in Africa before they were forced into servitude. There's a noticeable difference in use of color in this book. Everything is muted and pale when talking about working as a slave. And then when characters recount their lives in Africa, everything is vibrant and colorful. It's a subtle but clever way to emphasize the vast difference in quality of life between a free African and working as a slave in America. The document with all of these slaves' names appears twice in the book. To be honest, I overlooked it at the beginning of the book because it's an old piece of weathered parchment with flowing cursive script that's difficult to read, but it appears again at the end of the book adjacent to an inscribed copy that's much easier to read. My favorite part of this book is the author's note. It's at the back of the book, so it's easily overlooked, and I think it would have been wise to include it at the beginning of the book. The subtitle of this book is 11 Slaves, Their Lives and Dreams Brought to Life. There's only 10 slaves listed on the document. The 11th character, John, must be fictional from the author's imaginings, and the child, whose name Dora, has a fictional name. She appears on the document, but she's only listed as child. Those are trivial details that don't negate the quality of this book. After I finished reading it, I needed a moment. I took pause. I read a lot about slavery this month, but I was reading about fictional characters. Seeing the names of real people on a piece of paper affected me in a way that none of my other reading did this month. Next up is Grace by Natasha Deon, which stole the breath from my lungs. This book begins in Faunsdale, Alabama in 1848, and it follows the story of a slave girl named Naomi and her daughter, Josie. I can't tell you what makes this book unique without robbing you of the sense of shocking discovery that comes with reading it. I can tell you that the author approached this narrative from a clever angle, and she wrote authentic characters with flawless voices. The horrors of slavery and the violence of rape are depicted throughout this book, as are strong women who never stop fighting for themselves and for their loved ones. The first page of this book held me hostage. I had to keep reading, and after I finished the first chapter, I sat and read for hours. It's rare that a book grabs my attention in its opening pages and just demands that I read it to the degree that Grace does. Those of you who choose to read this book, and you should read this book, once you finish it, stop and think about the title. This book deserves far more attention than I'm giving it in this review, but I don't want to spoil it for you, so I'm just going to tell you that you need to read this book. My top pick from my Black History Month reads is The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. This book won the National Book Award for Fiction in 2016 and has subsequently garnered a lot of attention. I think readers sometimes feel pressured to love a book because it's earned prestige and awards, but I don't let that dictate my opinion of a book. I approached this book as a skeptic, and I was cautious throughout my reading to ensure that I wasn't being overly generous with my rating. It still turned out to be a 5-star read for me. And those of you who follow me on Goodreads know that I don't give out 5-star reviews all that often. At the heart of this book is a young woman named Cora who is a slave at a plantation in the antebellum South. She's approached by another slave named Caesar who tells her about the Underground Railroad and convinces her to run away with him so they can find the Underground Railroad together and journey north in search of freedom. Cora nestled into a special place in my heart, and she stayed there for 300 pages. Readers are first introduced to her when she's a young girl, and the only thing she can lay claim to is 3 square yards of dirt, which she is fierce in protecting. As a young woman, she proves to be courageous and resilient. On her odyssey, she witnesses unfathomable horrors, but she just keeps pushing forward past degradation, past heartache, past every unmovable force that stands in her way. Peppered throughout the book are short chapters that highlight secondary and tertiary characters. Those chapters add dramatic irony to the overall story, and I have been a sucker for dramatic irony since high school. I think it was wise of the author to include those chapters, and I think they indirectly work to make Cora an even more sympathetic character. Some of the fundamental points that Homegoing attempted to make is that slavery had a negative impact on people that lasted generations, and that shackles come in many forms, some visible on the body, others invisible in the mind. But I think this is the book that succeeds in driving those points home. The writing in this book is superb. The fundamental messages are timeless, and I completely understand why this novel won the National Book Award for Fiction. If you're thinking of picking up some of these books, I highly recommend The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead, and I implore you to take a look at Grace by Natasha Deon. I've provided links below to my written reviews of these books on Goodreads. If you've read any of these books, tell me what you thought of them in the comments below. That's all for today. Thanks, everybody.